The sun burned hot on the cracked pavement of Westmont, a neighborhood where dreams often seemed as worn as the buildings. Jamal Jackson, a 14-year-old boy with a lanky frame and boundless curiosity, pushed an old shopping cart down the street. Inside were a few aluminum cans and bits of scrap metal he had collected for extra cash. Jamal had learned early that life wasn't about waiting for miracles. It was about making the most of what you had. His mother, a nurse working double shifts at the local hospital, always told him, "Hard work is the path, Jamal, but heart is the engine that gets you there." As Jamal passed by the gated entrance of an upscale restaurant, he noticed something unusual. A sleek, cherry-red Lamborghini Aventador gleamed in the afternoon sun, its beauty drawing the eyes of passers-by. But what caught Jamal's attention wasn't just the car. It was the man standing nearby. Dressed in a tailored suit, the man exuded wealth and confidence, laughing into his phone as he held a leather briefcase. Jamal didn't recognize him, but he figured this had to be someone important. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jamal noticed something strange. A man in a maintenance uniform crouched near the car. The man's movements were hurried, his glances darting left and right. Jamal's sharp instincts kicked in. He might not have been rich, but he knew when something wasn't right. "Hey!" Jamal called out, his voice echoing. The man in the uniform froze, locking eyes with Jamal for a split second before dashing off, disappearing into a nearby alley. Jamal's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. He abandoned his cart and sprinted toward the suited man. "Wait!" Jamal shouted, waving his arms. "Don't get in that car!" The man frowned, his phone still pressed to his ear. "What are you talking about, kid?" "Beat it," he said dismissively. "I'm serious," Jamal pleaded. "Someone messed with your car, underneath, near the back." The man hesitated, his brow furrowing. Just then, a valet came over, handing the man his car keys. "Sir, is everything okay?" Jamal stepped forward, his voice trembling with urgency. "Please, I saw someone tampering with it. You gotta check it out before you drive." The man sighed, clearly skeptical, but something about Jamal's tone made him pause. He motioned for the valet to inspect the car. Moments later, the valet emerged, his face pale. "Sir," he said shakily, "the brake lines, they've been cut." The man's face darkened, a mix of anger and realization washing over him. He turned to Jamal, who stood there, breathing hard. "You saved my life," the man said quietly, his eyes locking onto Jamal's. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, scribbling in a notebook he used to sketch ideas for inventions. The Jackson apartment was small, the kind of place where the sound of the neighbor's TV seeped through the walls and every creak of the floorboards echoed. His mom had just left for her evening shift at the hospital, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender from her uniform. He couldn't stop replaying the events of the previous day in his mind. The red Lamborghini, the man in the suit, the tampered brakes. It all felt surreal. Jamal had always dreamed of doing something meaningful, but he never thought it would come like this. Just as he leaned back in his chair, there was a firm knock at the door. Jamal frowned. Visitors were rare, especially this late. He stood up cautiously, peeking through the peephole. His jaw dropped. Standing outside was the man from yesterday, Marcus Davenport, the millionaire whose life he had saved. He was dressed casually this time, but his presence was just as commanding. Beside him stood a sharply dressed woman holding a leather folder and a large man who looked like he could bench press a car. Jamal hesitated, unsure if he should open the door. "Jamal, right?" Marcus called through the door, his voice warm but firm. "It's me, Marcus Davenport. I just wanted to thank you properly. May I come in?" Heart pounding, Jamal opened the door slowly. Hi," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "What are you doing here?" Marcus smiled and stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the worn floor. He glanced around the modest apartment, his expression softening as he took in the faded wallpaper and mismatched furniture. "I owed you a visit," Marcus said. "You didn't just save my car. You saved my life. That's worth more than a simple thank you." Jamal shifted on his feet, unsure how to respond. "I just did what anyone would have done," he muttered. Marcus chuckled. "I've been in this world a long time, kid. Not everyone would have had the guts to do what you did." The woman stepped forward, offering her hand. "I'm Natalie, Mr. Davenport's assistant," she said with a smile. "It's nice to meet you, Jamal." Nice to meet you too," Jamal said, shaking her hand awkwardly. Marcus gestured to the large man. "And that's Carter, my driver and security. Don't let his size scare you. He's a teddy bear, most of the time." Carter nodded, giving Jamal a small smile. Jamal glanced at them, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "So, why are you really here?" he asked. Marcus's expression grew serious. "Because I want to help you, Jamal. Yesterday you changed my life. Now I'd like to return the favor." Jamal blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked around, his eyes settling on Jamal's notebook on the table. He picked it up, flipping through the pages of sketches and scribbles. "You're a thinker," he said, impressed. "These are some interesting ideas. Ever thought about where these could take you?" Jamal shrugged. "They're just for fun. I don't have the money to do anything with them." "Well, maybe we can change that," Marcus said. He pulled a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to Jamal. Jamal opened it cautiously, his eyes widening when he saw the contents. A business card with Marcus's name, along with a handwritten note that said, "Dream big. Let's talk." "I'm inviting you to my office tomorrow," Marcus said. "I want to learn more about you. Your goals, your ideas, your story. And maybe, just maybe, we can figure out a way to make those dreams a reality." Jamal stared at the card, his hands trembling slightly. "You're serious?" he whispered. Marcus smiled. "Dead serious. You've got potential, kid, and I think the world could use more people like you." Before Jamal could respond, another knock echoed at the door. He turned, confused, and opened it to find Mrs. Parker, the neighbor from down the hall, peering in. "Everything okay, Jamal?" she asked, her sharp eyes flicking between him and Marcus's entourage. Yeah," Jamal said quickly. "These are friends." Mrs. Parker raised an eyebrow but nodded. "All right. You know where to find me if you need anything." As she shuffled away, Marcus turned back to Jamal. "Think about it, Jamal. The offer's real. I'll send a car for you tomorrow morning, bright and early. Deal?" Jamal nodded, though he still felt like he was in a dream. "Deal." Marcus smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good. Now get some rest. Big things are ahead." As the trio left, Jamal closed the door, clutching the card tightly in his hand. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, like maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change forever. The next morning, Jamal stood outside his apartment building, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. The neighborhood was already awake, cars honking, kids playing basketball down the street, and the smell of fried bacon wafting from a nearby diner. Jamal tugged at the cuffs of his only button-up shirt, an old hand-me-down from his uncle, and glanced up at the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A sleek black car pulled up in front of him, the tinted windows glinting in the morning sun. The door opened, and Carter, Marcus Davenport's towering driver, stepped out. He wore a sharp black suit, his expression calm, but professional. "You ready, Jamal?" Carter asked, his deep voice kind. Jamal nodded, clutching his notebook tightly under one arm. "Yeah, I think so." "Good. Hop in, Mr. Davenport is waiting." The car's interior smelled like leather and cedar, and Jamal couldn't help but marvel at the plush seats and the quiet hum of the engine as they pulled away. He stared out the window, watching the city flash by. For a kid who'd barely been outside his neighborhood, every skyscraper and storefront felt like a glimpse into another world. When they finally arrived, Jamal's jaw dropped. Marcus's office wasn't just an office, it was an entire building. The glass skyscraper towered above him, shimmering in the sunlight. As Carter led him inside, Jamal felt like he'd stepped into a movie. The lobby was massive, with marble floors, towering plants, and a receptionist who smiled warmly as they passed. "Right this way," Carter said, guiding Jamal into a private elevator. The ride up was silent, except for the faint hum of the elevator. Jamal's palms were sweaty as he clutched his notebook. "What am I even doing here?" he thought. "This is way out of my league." The doors opened to reveal Marcus's office, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Marcus stood near the window, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup. When he turned and saw Jamal, his face lit up with a warm smile. "Jamal! Come in," Marcus said, motioning him forward. "How was the ride?" Good," Jamal replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt like a fish out of water in the luxurious office, his worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "Relax, kid. You're here because you earned it," Marcus said, gesturing to a chair across from his sleek glass desk. "Take a seat." Jamal sat down gingerly, placing his notebook on his lap. Marcus took a seat as well, folding his hands on the desk. "So, Jamal," Marcus began, his tone friendly but businesslike, "yesterday you showed incredible bravery. Most people wouldn't have said anything, let alone run toward danger the way you did. That's not something I see every day." Jamal shrugged, looking down. I couldn't let you get hurt. And I'm grateful for that," Marcus said, leaning forward. "But there's more to you than that, isn't there? Carter told me you brought this along." He nodded toward the notebook in Jamal's lap. Jamal froze, then slowly opened the notebook, revealing pages of rough sketches and notes. Some were for simple gadgets, a folding bike, a solar-powered phone charger, while others were more ambitious, like a prototype for a self-fixing drone. He hesitated, then slid the notebook across the desk. Marcus flipped through the pages, his eyebrows raising slightly. "These are impressive," he said, his voice genuine. "Where'd you learn to design like this?" Jamal shrugged. "I just figured it out. My mom couldn't afford to buy me stuff, so I'd take apart old junk and try to make my own things." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then closed the notebook. "You've got a talent, Jamal, but talent needs opportunities, and that's why I brought you here." Jamal's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned back in his chair. "I want to invest in you. You've got potential, and I believe with the right resources you could do something incredible. So here's the deal. I'll fund your education, science programs, mentorships, whatever you need to take your ideas to the next level. In return, I want you to work with me. Help me develop these ideas, bring them to life." Jamal's jaw dropped. You do that for me?" Marcus smiled. "Consider it an investment in the future, and in someone I believe in." Jamal stared at the desk, his mind spinning. This was more than he'd ever dared to dream. He thought about his mom, her tired face as she left for work every day. He thought about the people in his neighborhood who believed the world didn't care about them. And he thought about himself, the boy who'd always wanted to prove he was worth something. I don't know what to say," Jamal stammered. Marcus chuckled. "Say yes, Jamal. That's all I need." Jamal looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze. There was something genuine in the man's eyes, something that told Jamal this wasn't just charity. It was a chance to change his life. "Yes," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I'll do it." Marcus grinned, extending his hand. "Welcome to the team." Jamal shook his hand, a wave of excitement and nervousness washing over him. For the first time in his life, the future didn't seem like a distant dream. It felt real, tangible, and within reach. The next week passed in a blur for Jamal. His life, once limited to the few square blocks of his neighborhood, now felt like it was expanding at a dizzying pace. Marcus Davenport had sent over a sleek laptop, a stack of books on engineering and design, and a schedule packed with mentorship sessions and site visits. Jamal's mother, though overwhelmed by the sudden change, watched her son with a pride that made her eyes glisten. "Jamal, baby," she said one morning as he prepared for another day, "you've always been smart, but now it feels like the world is finally seeing it too." Jamal smiled, hugging her tightly. "Thanks, Mom. I'll make you proud." That afternoon, Jamal found himself standing in front of Davenport Enterprises, Marcus's sprawling innovation hub. The building buzzed with energy. Workers moved briskly between labs and conference rooms, and the hum of cutting-edge machinery filled the air. Carter escorted him through security, giving him a reassuring nod. "You're gonna like this place," Carter said. "Lots of folks like you. Big ideas and hungry to make them happen." They stopped in front of a glass-walled workshop where a group of young engineers tinkered with a robotic arm. Jamal pressed his face to the glass, his heart racing. "This is where I belong," he thought. Inside, Marcus was waiting. He waved Jamal in, greeting him with a firm handshake. "Welcome to your new playground," Marcus said, gesturing to the sprawling workspace. "This is where ideas become reality." Jamal took it all in. The rows of high-tech tools, the 3D printers whirring away, and the whiteboards covered in equations and diagrams. "This is amazing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus chuckled. "It's yours to use. But first, let me introduce you to someone." A tall woman with dark braids and sharp eyes stepped forward, her lab coat spotless. "This is Dr. Keisha Monroe," Marcus said. "She's one of our top engineers, and she's going to be your mentor." Dr. Monroe extended a hand, her smile warm. "Jamal, I've heard a lot about you. Marcus says you've got potential. Let's see what you've got." Jamal shook her hand, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll work hard." For the next few weeks, Jamal threw himself into the work. Under Dr. Monroe's guidance, he learned to refine his sketches, prototype designs, and troubleshoot problems. He absorbed everything like a sponge, staying late to experiment with materials and methods. His notebook filled with new ideas, each one bolder than the last. One afternoon, as Jamal fine-tuned a small drone prototype, Dr. Monroe watched him from across the room. "You've got a good eye for details," she said, walking over. "Most people your age rush through things, but you take your time." Jamal shrugged. "I just want it to work, you know? I want to prove I belong here." Dr. Monroe's expression softened. "You don't have to prove anything, Jamal. You're here because you earned it." Her words hit him deeply, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe it might be true. But all was not well. One evening, after a long day at the workshop, Jamal noticed something strange. He was walking past one of the high-security labs when he heard voices, a heated argument coming from behind a closed door. He recognized Marcus's voice, low and tense. "This isn't what we agreed on," Marcus said. A second voice, colder and unfamiliar, replied, "You knew what you were getting into, Marcus. Don't forget who helped you get here." Jamal froze, his curiosity piqued. He inched closer, straining to hear more, but the voices stopped abruptly. A moment later, the door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his sharp features and piercing eyes giving him an air of authority. He spotted Jamal immediately, his gaze narrowing. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his tone icy. I was just leaving," Jamal stammered, backing away quickly. The man watched him go, his expression unreadable. Jamal hurried down the hall, his mind racing. What was that about, he wondered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. A warning. The next day, Jamal confronted Marcus during a break in their session. "Mr. Davenport," Jamal began hesitantly, "who was that guy I saw last night? The one in the suit?" Marcus's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, him. Just a business associate. Nothing for you to worry about." Jamal nodded, but the answer didn't sit right with him. There was something in Marcus's tone, a hint of unease that Jamal couldn't ignore. As the weeks went on, Jamal's success in the workshop continued to grow, but so did his unease. The man in the suit began appearing more frequently, always lurking in the shadows of Marcus's operations. And though Marcus remained supportive, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that his mentor was carrying a burden he wasn't sharing. One night, as Jamal worked late on a new project, Dr. Monroe approached him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression serious. "Jamal," she said quietly, "I need you to be careful. Not everyone in this building has your best interests at heart." Jamal looked up, alarmed. "What do you mean?" Dr. Monroe hesitated, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Just trust your instincts, and if something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it." Her warning lingered in Jamal's mind as he packed up for the night. For the first time, he wondered if the dream Marcus had offered him might come with strings attached. Jamal couldn't ignore the warning from Dr. Monroe. Her words lingered in his mind as he lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of his room. He thought about Marcus's tense conversation, the mysterious man in the suit, and the way Dr. Monroe had seemed genuinely concerned. "What am I getting myself into?" he wondered. But curiosity burned hotter than fear. Jamal knew he couldn't leave it alone. If something was wrong, he needed to know. The next day, Jamal arrived at Davenport Enterprises with a plan. He'd work as usual in the lab during the day, but after hours, he'd explore the building to see if he could uncover more about Marcus's business associate. He hated sneaking around, but his gut told him it was necessary. "Jamal, you're doing excellent work," Marcus said during a brief check-in that afternoon. "The drone prototype looks fantastic. I think we're ready to move into the next phase soon." Jamal forced a smile. "Thanks, Mr. Davenport. I'm learning a lot." Marcus grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good. Keep it up, kid. You've got a bright future ahead." The sincerity in Marcus's voice made Jamal hesitate for a moment. He wanted to trust the man who had given him so much, but the shadows around him were growing harder to ignore. The first clue. That evening, when most of the staff had left, Jamal lingered in the workshop, pretending to organize tools. He kept an eye on the hall, waiting for the night security team to begin their rounds. Once the coast was clear, he slipped out of the lab and headed toward the restricted section of the building. He reached the high-security lab, where he had overheard Marcus's conversation days before. The glass doors were locked, but Jamal noticed a keypad near the entrance. He'd seen workers enter codes before, and though he didn't know the exact combination, he had a guess based on their finger movements. 4219. Holding his breath, Jamal entered the code. The door clicked open, and he stepped inside. The room was unlike anything he'd seen before. Unlike the open, collaborative spaces of the other labs, this one was cold and sterile. Rows of computers hummed quietly, their screens displaying schematics and data he couldn't decipher. In the center of the room stood a large, covered object. Jamal approached it cautiously, lifting the corner of the black tarp. His eyes widened. Beneath the tarp was a vehicle, not a car, but something sleeker, like a futuristic armored transport. The design was ominous, with reinforced panels and weapon mounts that gave it a menacing edge. "What is this?" Jamal whispered to himself. Before he could investigate further, a voice made him freeze. "You shouldn't be here." Caught, Jamal turned slowly, his heart pounding. It was the man in the suit, the same one he'd seen with Marcus before. "What are you doing here, kid?" the man asked, his tone icy. I was just curious," Jamal stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. The man stepped closer, his sharp features hardening. "Curiosity can get you into trouble. You don't belong in this part of the building." Before Jamal could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Jamal." It was Marcus. He strode into the room, his face a mixture of shock and concern. "Marcus, "We need to talk about your boy here," the man in the suit said, gesturing toward Jamal. Marcus held up a hand. "I'll handle this, Robert. Leave us." The man hesitated, then nodded curtly and walked out, his glare lingering on Jamal as he left. Once they were alone, Marcus turned to Jamal, his expression unreadable. "Jamal, what are you doing in here?" Jamal swallowed hard. I wanted to know what's going on. I overheard you talking the other day, and Dr. Monroe said I should be careful. I thought maybe something was wrong." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he looked tired, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "Jamal," he said softly, "there are things about my business that are complicated. Not everything I do is simple or easy to explain, but you have to trust me when I say I'm trying to make the world a better place." Jamal frowned. "Then why are there people like him, Robert? And why does this look like a weapon?" He gestured toward the armored vehicle. Marcus hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The truth is, some of the projects we work on here are defensive in nature. I've partnered with government contractors to develop technology that can save lives. That vehicle, for example, is designed to protect humanitarian workers in conflict zones." Jamal stared at him, trying to process the explanation. It made sense, but something about the way Marcus avoided meeting his eyes left a pit in his stomach. "Jamal," Marcus said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I need you to stay out of this lab. Focus on your work in the other areas. Can you promise me that?" Jamal nodded slowly. "Okay, Mr. Davenport." But as he left the room, escorted by Carter, his mind churned with questions. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something Marcus wasn't telling him. The buried truth. Over the next few days, Jamal tried to focus on his work, but his curiosity wouldn't let go. He began observing Marcus and Robert more closely, noting the times they disappeared into private meetings or exchanged hushed words. Late one evening, Jamal took a chance and searched the company's public database. He found little about Robert, but one old article caught his eye. It mentioned a partnership between Marcus Davenport and a defense contractor involved in ethically questionable projects overseas. His stomach sank. If Marcus was working with people like that, what did it mean for Jamal's role at the company? Dr. Monroe's words echoed in his mind. "Trust your instincts, and if something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it." Jamal knew he had to dig deeper. The truth might be dangerous, but if he was going to stay in Marcus's world, he needed to know exactly what kind of world it was. Monroe might be the key to getting answers. During a coffee break, he approached her, lowering his voice. "Dr. Monroe, can I talk to you? Privately?" She glanced around, then nodded. "Meet me in Lab C during lunch. Make sure no one follows you." When lunchtime arrived, Jamal slipped away from the bustling workshop and found Dr. Monroe in the small lab. She closed the door behind him, folding her arms with a wary expression. "What's going on, Jamal?" He hesitated, then blurted out, "I think something's wrong with Mr. Davenport's projects. I overheard him arguing with someone, and I've seen Robert sneaking around. They're working on things that don't feel right." Dr. Monroe's expression hardened, and she let out a slow sigh. "You're perceptive, Jamal. Too perceptive for your own good." "So I'm right?" he pressed. She hesitated, then nodded. Marcus started with good intentions. He wanted to create technology that could protect people, but somewhere along the line, he got in too deep. Robert is a representative for a defense conglomerate. They fund some of our projects, and they've pushed Marcus into developing tech that can be used for less noble purposes. Jamal's stomach churned. "Like weapons?" Dr. Monroe nodded grimly. "Yes. That armored vehicle you saw, it's not just for humanitarian workers. It's also being adapted for military use. And that's just the tip of the iceberg." Jamal's mind raced. Why doesn't Marcus stop them? Because they control the funding, she explained. Without their money, this entire operation would collapse. And Marcus? He's too proud to admit he's made a mistake. He thinks he can fix it from the inside, but I'm not so sure. Jamal took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. What can I do? Dr. Monroe's eyes widened. Jamal, this isn't your fight. You're just a kid. Focus on your projects and stay out of this. It's too dangerous. But Jamal shook his head. If I don't do something, who will? The unauthorized file. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Jamal snuck into one of the server rooms. Dr. Monroe's warning rang in his ears, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. Using his workshop credentials, he accessed the network and began searching for files related to Robert and the projects he oversaw. Most of the documents were encrypted, but one folder caught his eye: Project Horizon. Jamal clicked on it, and his heart sank as diagrams and reports filled the screen. It wasn't just vehicles. They were developing autonomous drones, surveillance systems, and weaponized robotics. Each file painted a clearer picture of how far Marcus had gone to appease his shadowy partners. Just as Jamal was copying some of the files onto a flash drive, he heard footsteps outside the server room. His pulse quickened, and he yanked the drive out of the computer, slipping it into his pocket. The door opened, and Marcus stepped inside. His face froze when he saw Jamal. "Jamal," Marcus said, his tone cold and measured. "What are you doing here?" Jamal tried to play it off. I needed to check something for my drone project. The system wasn't working earlier." Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jamal thought he might press further. But then Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's late, Jamal. Go home. We'll talk tomorrow." Jamal nodded, his heart racing as he walked past Marcus and out of the room. The confrontation. The next morning, Jamal sat at his kitchen table, staring at the flash drive. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. He needed to confront Marcus, but he also needed a backup plan in case things went south. After arriving at Davenport Enterprises, Jamal found Dr. Monroe in the lab. He pulled her aside, showing her the files. Her face paled as she scrolled through the contents. "This is worse than I thought," she muttered. "What do we do?" Jamal asked. Dr. Monroe looked conflicted. "If we take this to the authorities, Marcus could lose everything. But if we don't, this technology could hurt a lot of people." Before they could decide, the lab door opened, and Marcus entered, flanked by Robert. His expression was grim. "Jamal," Marcus said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "we need to talk." Jamal's stomach flipped. "I can explain?" "No need," Marcus interrupted. "Robert told me you accessed restricted files last night. I gave you a chance, Jamal. I trusted you." "And I trusted you," Jamal shot back, his voice shaking. "But you've been lying to me. You're making weapons for people like him." He pointed at Robert, who smirked but said nothing. Marcus's expression darkened. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is," Jamal said. "You're helping people who don't care about saving lives. They're using you, and you're letting them." Marcus seemed to waver for a moment, but Robert stepped forward. "That's enough," he said coldly. "This kid has no idea what he's talking about." Jamal clenched his fists. "I know exactly what's going on, and if you don't stop, I'll make sure everyone else knows too." Robert's smirk disappeared. "You're making a mistake, kid." "Enough, Robert," Marcus said, his voice firm. He turned back to Jamal, his eyes filled with regret. "Go home, Jamal. I'll handle this." But Jamal shook his head. "You can't handle this alone. Let me help you fix it before it's too late." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he nodded, his expression resolute. "All right, Jamal. Let's fix this." Marcus sat behind his desk, his face etched with tension, as Jamal and Dr. Monroe stood across from him. The files Jamal had stolen from the server sat open on Marcus's computer, the evidence glaring back at them. "I can't believe it's gotten this bad," Marcus muttered, scrolling through the documents. He looked up, his voice heavy. I should have stopped this a long time ago. Then let's stop it now, Jamal said firmly. Doctor, Monroe crossed her arms. It's not going to be easy. Robert and his people aren't just funding this. They're controlling it. If you try to pull out, they'll retaliate. Marcus leaned back, running a hand over his face. They've threatened me before. They made it clear that if I walk away, they'll destroy everything I've built and ruin anyone who tries to help me. So, what do we do? Jamal asked, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. Marcus sat up straight, determination hardening his features. We fight back, but we have to be smart about it. We need to gather more evidence, enough to expose them and shut them down for good. And we can't do it alone. Dr. Monroe nodded. I can pull together technical records, emails, blueprints, anything that shows what Robert's been doing. But we'll need a way to get the information out safely. Marcus turned to Jamal. You've already shown you're resourceful, Jamal. I'll need you to help Dr. Monroe and keep an eye on Robert. He doesn't know how much you've found yet, but he'll be watching you. Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. I can handle it. Marcus smiled faintly. I believe you can. Gathering evidence over the next week, Jamal and Dr. Monroe worked tirelessly. Dr. Monroe combed through company records, uncovering contracts, invoices, and correspondence that tied Robert's defense conglomerate to shady deals. Jamal, meanwhile, stayed close to the workshop, keeping up appearances while subtly observing Robert's movements. Late one night, as Jamal sifted through a pile of outdated project files, he stumbled across a folder marked Confidential. Inside were specifications for a new drone model, one far more dangerous than anything the company had developed before. This isn't defense, Jamal whispered, his stomach turning. It's a weapon. He brought the file to Dr. Monroe, who paled as she read through it. This is the smoking gun, she said. If we can prove they're planning to sell this to hostile buyers, it'll be the end for Robert and his backers. But how do we prove it? Jamal asked. Dr. Monroe hesitated, then said, We'll need to intercept one of their communications. If we can get access to their private server, we might find proof of their buyers. The break-in, the plan was set. Marcus arranged for a distraction during a high-profile meeting, giving Jamal and Dr. Monroe a window to access Robert's private office. On the night of the operation, Jamal's nerves were on edge as he waited for Marcus's signal. The building felt eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the ticking of the clock in his head. Finally, Marcus's voice crackled through Jamal's earpiece. You're clear. Go now. Jamal and Dr. Monroe moved quickly, slipping into the restricted area. They reached Robert's office, and Dr. Monroe pulled out a device to override the lock. Hurry! Jamal urged, glancing over his shoulder. The door clicked open, and they rushed inside. Dr. Monroe went straight to the computer while Jamal kept watch. This is it, she whispered, her fingers flying over the keyboard. I'm in. Minutes felt like hours as she navigated the system, downloading files onto an encrypted drive. Finally, she pulled back, a triumphant smile on her face. Got it, she said. But before they could leave, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Someone's coming, Jamal hissed. They hid behind a row of cabinets just as the door opened. Robert stepped inside, followed by two men in black suits. His eyes scanned the room, suspicion flickering across his face. Something's not right, Robert muttered. I want a full sweep of this building. Now. The men nodded and left, but Robert lingered. Jamal held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, Robert finally exited the room, slamming the door behind him. Let's go, Dr. Monroe whispered. They slipped out of the office and made their way back to the workshop, where Marcus was waiting. The fallout. The files, Doctor. Monroe had retrieved were damning. Detailed records of weapons deals, covert communications with rogue buyers, and payments funneled through offshore accounts. "This is everything we need," Marcus said, staring at the screen, "but getting it to the right people is going to be tricky." Dr. Monroe nodded. "We'll need to involve the authorities. But we can't trust everyone. They might have people on the inside." Marcus turned to Jamal. "Do you trust anyone outside this building, Jamal? Someone who could help us?" Jamal thought for a moment, then nodded. "My neighbor, Mrs. Parker. Her son works for the FBI. I can get this to her." Marcus smiled faintly. "Good, let's move quickly. Robert won't sit still once he realizes what we've done." At the escape, Jamal delivered the files to Mrs. Parker that night, explaining everything as quickly as he could. Her eyes widened as she realized the gravity of the situation. "I'll make sure my son gets this," she promised. "You've done something brave, Jamal." But just as Jamal returned to the building, he saw black SUVs pulling up outside. Men in suits poured out, armed and moving with purpose. "They're here," Jamal whispered into his earpiece. "Get out now!" Marcus barked. Jamal sprinted back into the building, weaving through the halls as alarms blared. He found Marcus and Dr. Monroe in the workshop, frantically packing up critical equipment. "We can't stay here," Marcus said. "They'll tear this place apart." "Where do we go?" Jamal asked. Marcus hesitated, then said, "I have a safe house. Follow me." Chapter 8. Exposing the Truth. Preview. Jamal, Marcus, and Dr. Monroe flee to the safe house, where they prepare to release the evidence. As Robert closes in, they face one final confrontation that will determine the fate of Davenport Enterprises and their lives. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8? The black SUV roared down the highway, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Marcus was behind the wheel, his jaw set as he navigated the empty roads. Beside him sat Dr. Monroe, clutching the encrypted drive containing the damning evidence against Robert. Jamal sat in the back seat, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. "Are we safe here?" Jamal asked, glancing out the window at the shadowy outlines of trees whipping past. "For now," Marcus replied. "The safe house is an hour away, and it's off the grid. They won't find us easily, Doctor." Monroe turned to Jamal, her expression both serious and reassuring. "You've done more than enough, Jamal. Once we get to the safe house, we'll send the files to the FBI anonymously. This will be over soon." But Jamal wasn't so sure. He could feel the weight of the danger pressing on them, as though Robert's reach was just inches behind. The safe house. The safe house was a small cabin, hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and silence. As they pulled up, Marcus killed the engine and led them inside. The interior was sparse but functional, a single room with a table, a few chairs, and an old computer setup. "This is where we make our stand," Marcus said, powering up the computer. "We'll upload the files to a secure server and contact the authorities." Jamal sat beside him, watching as Dr. Monroe plugged in the drive and began encrypting the files for transmission. The process was painfully slow, each percentage of progress feeling like an eternity. "What if they find us before we finish?" Jamal asked, his voice tight. "They won't," Marcus said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Just then, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence. All three of them froze. "They're here," Dr. Monroe whispered. Marcus grabbed a small handgun from a drawer, his face grim. "Jamal, hide, now." Jamal didn't argue. He slipped behind a stack of crates in the corner, peeking out as Marcus and Dr. Monroe prepared to confront whoever was outside. The cabin door burst open, and Robert stepped in, flanked by two armed men. "Well, well," Robert said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I warned you, Marcus. You should have stayed in line." Marcus leveled the gun at him. "This ends tonight, Robert. We have the evidence. The authorities are already on their way. Robert smirked. Do you really think they'll get here in time? Or that they'll even care? People like me don't lose, Marcus. We make the rules. You don't make the truth, Dr. Monroe snapped. And the world is about to see who you really are. Robert's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Take them, he ordered his men. As the armed men moved forward, Jamal acted on instinct. He grabbed a wrench from the crate beside him and hurled it at one of the men. The wrench struck him in the shoulder, causing him to stumble. The distraction was enough for Marcus to fire a warning shot, forcing the others to duck. Run! Marcus shouted. Jamal bolted toward the computer, his fingers flying over the keyboard to complete the upload. The progress bar inched closer to 100%, but the commotion behind him made his hands shake. Robert lunged toward the table, but Dr. Monroe tackled him, buying Jamal precious seconds. Almost there, Jamal muttered, his heart pounding. One of the armed men recovered and aimed his weapon at Jamal. Before he could fire, Marcus tackled him, knocking the gun away. The cabin erupted into chaos, but Jamal focused on the screen as the progress bar hit 100%. A confirmation message flashed. Files uploaded successfully. It's done, Jamal shouted. A dying Caesar, the final confrontation. Hearing Jamal's words, Robert's fury boiled over. He shoved Dr. Monroe aside and lunged at Jamal, grabbing him by the collar. You think you've won? Robert snarled, his grip tightening. This won't stop us. Jamal's fear turned to defiance. It'll stop you, he said, glaring into Robert's eyes. The truth is out now. Before Robert could respond, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. His grip loosened, and panic flickered across his face. Marcus stood, breathing heavily, but unbroken. It's over, Robert. Walk away now, or let the authorities drag you out. Robert scowled, then motioned to his men. We're leaving, he snapped. But this isn't over. As they retreated into the night, Jamal collapsed into a chair, his adrenaline fading. Marcus and Dr. Monroe joined him, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. You did it, Jamal, Dr. Monroe said softly. You saved us. Marcus placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. You're the bravest kid I've ever met. I owe you everything. Justice served. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of changes. The files Jamal had uploaded led to a federal investigation that exposed Robert's corruption and dismantled his organization. Marcus cooperated fully with the authorities, using the opportunity to rebuild Davenport Enterprises with transparency and integrity. Jamal, meanwhile, became something of a local hero. Reporters wanted his story, but he kept a low profile, focusing on his projects and spending time with his mom. One afternoon, Marcus visited Jamal's apartment, carrying a folder and a small box. I wanted to thank you properly, Marcus said, handing Jamal the box. Inside was a sleek smartwatch, customized with Marcus's company logo. And this, Marcus added, handing over the folder, is a scholarship, fully paid. You'll be attending the best engineering program in the state. Jamal's eyes widened. You're serious? Marcus smiled. You've earned it. You have a bright future ahead, Jamal, and I want to make sure you have every chance to reach it. The New Horizon. As Jamal stood on the balcony that evening, watching the city lights twinkle, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had faced danger, uncovered the truth, and emerged stronger. And now, the future stretched before him, limitless and filled with promise. Ready for dinner, Jamal? His mom called from inside. Yeah, he said, smiling as he stepped back into the apartment. The past was behind him, and the world was finally his to conquer.